have to say. I'll say, though, I'll just correct you, Gail, I'm a keynote in Tunisia, not in Vigo. Okay, but to our what we're here for today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Izis Elorza, Izis, as most of us like to call her, who is Associate Professor of English Linguistics at the beautiful and historic University of Salamanca, which, by the way, is my favorite city in Spain. So I'm very envious. Where she teaches systemic functional grammar, corpus linguistics, and multimodality. She leads a great research group on linguistic descriptions of English based at the University of Salamanca. And her research interests include corpus linguistics, multimodal representations, which she'll be talking about today, and the applicability of linguistic descriptions to educational and social contexts. And by the way, Izis publishes equally in Spanish and English, which is, we all know, is a great feat. So welcome, and Izis will be talking to us about ideational meaning in narrative picture books, multimodal features and challenges for systemic analysis. And if you have questions throughout, you could pop them in the chat or just hold them to the end. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to have this talk today. I think it is a very important, a very good idea to have these talks, this kind of research seminars, so that we can make visible what we are doing. And today, as Anna has already said, I'm going to deal with multimodality. I'm going to focus on ideational meaning as it is construed in picture books. So let me share my presentation. Okay. Can you see it?
And I just say we are recording this, so I hope that's okay with everybody, and I'll make it available at some point later. So thank you, Izis.
Okay, so thank you very much for this as well. Right, so we are going to deal, as I said, with multimodality in this particular multimodal text, which are picture books. I'm interested in addressing the challenges that I have found when doing this kind of analysis. My main interest is if this can be helpful for doctorate students or people interested in this kind of analysis. So far, so good. So the idea is to share with you the kind of challenges that I have found and well, some of the decisions that I made in order to try to solve them. Basically, that's the main idea of today's talk. And hold on a second, because this is not working. So I'm sharing again. Okay. Right. Now it is. Okay, so in the first part of my talk, I'm going to deal with multimodal visual and verbal. I'm dealing with bimodal resources. So picture books are construing meaning by means of visual and verbal resources. So just in case that somebody is not familiarized with this, I will just address some the most important issues taking place there. And in the second part of the talk, I will address some challenges, such as the units of analysis to use and things like that. So I would like to start by two caveats. The first one is that picture books look very simple at a first glance. So they are, as Eva Greshnik highlights, rather short, and after all, they are usually written for children who are at the beginning of literature acquisition. So thus one would not expect notable complexity in picture book language, and yet that is exactly what is to be found when taking a close look, as I think that I will show today. My second caveat has to do with a notable distinction and an important one between illustrated books and picture books that are two different types of multimodal text. I'm going to highlight very few hints for both of them, because today we are going to concentrate on picture books in particular. So what happens with illustrated books is that the narration doesn't depend on the image at all. So the images have very specific functions, such as contextualize the verbal narration, both in terms of the narrative and some social contextualization as well. So the image is always dependent on the verbal narration, and typically it restates the meanings that have been produced verbally. So the connection between the two modes is like a redundant narrative, really, because images illustrate the verbal mode or the verbal information. In addition, in traditional narratives, such as fairy tales and so on, there is also some aesthetical content that is very obvious in the recontextualizations in terms of chronology, creativity, ideology. I'm going to show just a very popular example, the sleeper episode in Cinderella, and you can see just different snapshots of this episode from Cinderellas that have been produced in different times. And you can see how the episode is interpreted according to the perspective of each moment of production, including Disney, for instance, as well, and so on and so forth. What happens with picture books is that a meaning is construed by combining visual and verbal contributions. So it's an intersymbiosis procedure, if you want to, or production. So the multimodality has certain textual functions which are different from illustrated books. So what we have is that the development of the narration runs in both modes in parallel, maybe not. So it's like playing with that. It can run in parallel, or maybe one mode can contradict the other, or one mode can complement the other, and so on and so forth. Also, meaning can be made more explicit or more implicit by this intertwining of visual and verbal resources. And why they are so good and complex at the same time is because we can create, or authors, writers, illustrators can create narrative tensions, irony, and other narrative effects by means of by making visual and verbal resources diverge. You have two snapshots there of two picture books. The one on your left is 10,000 Dresses, which is a picture book that has been very much analyzed. It is considered to be the first picture book with a transgender character, main character in the story. The other one is Rose's Walk from the 1960s, the story about a hen that goes for a walk. The thing is that in order to analyze or to consider what is going on in this kind of multimodal text, we need some kind of integrate multisemiotic model. There are several ones. Here I just have included a snapshot of Victor Lim's one, the integrative multisemiotic model. I'm not going to describe it extensively, but I just want to locate what I'm going to address today. Because as we have seen, we can consider things like the typography that has been used, or the kind of graphics that have been used, and so on and so forth. Today, I'm just going to be concerned with the lexicogrammar in terms of the verbal mode, how the verbal resources are constructing the story in lexicogrammatical terms, and also the visual grammar. And I will draw on Kress and Van Leeuwen's work on the visual social semiotics. So we will be moving within the content plane, what Victor identifies as the content plane. So I will be dealing with discourse semantics all the time. One of the things that we can say about picture books as well is that they are narrative and sequential. This also has a repercussion or a consequence when we're attempting to analyze characters in them. And I would like to rely on this one, which is this little story. It is a very nice book for very young readers. And we are going to see how the verbal resources and the visual ones intertwine. So first of all, we are going to focus on the verbal content in the story. And the story literally says, well, the title is Rosie's Walk, and it says, Rosie the hen went for a walk across the yard, around the pond, over the haycock, past the mill, through the fence, under the beehives, and got back in time for dinner. Nothing particularly exciting in terms of the complexity of the story, of course. Here you have a transitivity analysis of the verbal mode. I'm not concerned with different approaches to this transitivity analysis. We have an actor, which is Rosie the hen. We have, as you can see, we have two clauses there, two ideas. Rosie the hen went for a walk, and we have a lot of circumstantial information indicating the places where she has been to. And then we have another idea, another clause linked to the first one, saying that she gets back in time for dinner, as easy as that. So as I was saying, I'm not very much concerned with whether went for a walk is a verbal group or could be interpreted in a different way, like for a walk being a prepositional phrase and so on and so forth. What I'm concerned with is with the verbal, the highest load of verbal information goes to the circumstantial location of place. So it is not that much about the different actions that Rosie performs as to the places where she goes to. When we look into the visual information, what we have is that we have a lot of information available at the same time. When we read that Rosie the hen went for a walk, what we can see is a lot of other kinds of information at the same time. And this kind of simultaneity and availability of all this visual material is one of the things that is going to have a consequence on the kind of analysis that we are going to carry on. So this is what Martin and Rose call the orientation stage. So the very beginning of the story where the reader is positioned within the story in a certain way. And this is the final opening of the story. So we have like the two ideas. Rosie the hen went for a walk is introduced in the very beginning of the story. And the second idea is introduced just in the last opening of the story. So what about the rest of the information? If we look at this in terms of verbal distribution or the distribution of the verbal material, as I said, the greatest load of verbal information goes to the circumstantial location. And this is what we are going to find scattered along the whole story. We are going to look into the final openings. Well, by the way, picture books typically are not paged. They don't have page numbers. So we refer to the different parts of them in terms of the opening, the first, the second, the third opening, and so on and so forth. So we are going to jump into the 10th opening, and this is what we see. This is through the fence when the hen is going through the fence. This is next opening. No verbal information, but loads of visual information. Under the beehives. And finally, gets back in time for dinner. So, well, what we have seen here has to do with this divergence. The visual is narrating a story, whereas the verbal is narrating another story. So this story is typically found very funny for children and not so children. and not so young children. So the question is that we can see how the narrative pace, the actions that are narrated visually and verbally are very different. We have many actions that are only narrated visually and very few actions that are narrated verbally. At the same time, the narrative commitment of each mode is very different as well. Very different, so different that we cannot know, or we cannot state for sure who the main character in the story is, because if we attend the verbal resources used, we only have one single character. This story is about Rosie. But when we look into the visual narration, we have two participants. One is the fox and the other one is the hen. And the connection between them is what is going to mark the kind of narration that is constructed visually. So we have to, when we are going to analyze this, we have to make these decisions. I mean, decisions in terms of if I'm going to describe the characters in the story, I cannot avoid focusing on the fox, but the fox is not represented verbally. So it's how this intertwining is going to make things more complex in terms of analysis, so to speak. So Victor Lim highlights this that the visual and the verbal modes have co-equal statuses. So the idea is that both semiotic modes are complementary, they are different, but potentially they can function independently. For instance, we have many picture books that are wordless. This is one of them, titled The Arrival by Sean Ton, or also Isa Watanabe's Migrants, which are two of the books that we are analyzing now in our ongoing research, and they are only relying on the visual resource. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Izis, you want to take a minute or two off, because yeah, I think it's the dry, dusty Spanish air.
It is, yeah. I'm sorry.
And if we were at a conference, we'd be running in with a glass of water for you.
Okay. I think I can carry on. So I was just taking Victor's words to highlight that both modes can, sorry, that both modes can function independently. But this doesn't solve the questions that we need to address when we are going to have the perspective of the analyst. So in order to carry out the multimodal discourse analysis, what we need is that we have to line them up, because they are comparable areas of meaning. We are not relying on that they are going to have identical sets sorry, of choices, but comparable sets of choices, yes. So I will move into this perspective, into the analyst perspective here. So what we are doing in order to line up this and to be able to study, to analyze this ideational meaning or any other kinds of meaning, we are going to rely on those comparable sets of choices. Okay, so for the verbal mode, I'm of course relying on Halliday's perspective. So we are dealing with a transitivity analysis. And for the visual, for the representational, as Kress and Van Leeuwen called that, meaning, I'm relying mainly on Kress and Van Leeuwen, and also on the other scholars, as we'll see later, who have developed this work, particularly for picture book analysis, mainly Claire Painter, Jim Martin, and Len Unsworth in Australia. Okay, so if we are dealing with transitivity analysis and we want to analyze characters, we are going to interpret that they are participants in the stories, performing certain roles, and those roles are the ones that have been defined for ideational meaning, for experiential meaning in particular. So those characters are going to be interpreted as being actors or participating as actors, or maybe as goals, as behaviors, as senses, phenomena, sayers, targets, career attributes, identifiers, token values, or existence. We are not going to see cases of existence, okay? Existential clauses are found in verbal mode, but this idea of existent is not going to be identified with characters in picture books. We will address to something that we will call conceptual images, but that is different, as we will see. So we need some kind of representational structures, I mean, to look into that. And something that is going to be relevant is the distinction between narrative structures and conceptual structures, as I was saying. So picture books are narrative, characters are the participants being the focus of the narrations. So for the narrative structures, we are just, as I was saying, relying on transitivity, the different elements of a process that is linking participants in certain circumstances. But we are also going to find conceptual structures sometimes. Conceptual structures, according to Kress and Van Leeuwen, can be of different kinds: classificatory, analytic, symbolic. Depending on the kind of multimodal text that we are analyzing, we will have a variety, greater variety, or smaller variety of those possibilities. Here, I wanted to present this snapshot of two different parts of the same picture book. This picture book is My Shoes and I. And what we can see on the left is a double spread representing this narrative image telling a story with a combination with verbal information as well. But what we have on the right is two conceptual images that are showing features that are attributes of the main character in the story. The shoes in the box are found at the very beginning of the book, even before the story starts, as the narration starts properly. And the one that you have, the worn out shoes, which are the same ones, to be found. This conceptual image is to be found at the end of the story, with when everything has happened already. So these are used as symbolic attributes of the narration or of the character. And this is something that we are going to find very often in picture books. Another type of possibilities is that sometimes we find narrative images that are constructed as sequences of events, as the example that you have there from My Name Is Not Refugee. And when we find conceptual images, we can find them also constructed as taxonomies or flowcharts, networks, and so on. Like in the example that you have here, taken from Here We Are by Jeffers, which is a different kind of picture book. It is not exactly a narrative one. So as I said that I was going to talk about ideational meaning, this also includes, of course, the logical metafunction, not just the experiential one. And we can also see how this is involved in the picture books as well, or in visual verbal texts. This is happening in two ways. Well, this system network that I have taken from Len Unsworth talks about the connection in terms of a projection or conjunction, looking into how the two modes intertwine in a certain way or another. So I'm just going to look into this example. This is belongs to Janine Baker's wonderful picture book titled Circle. And this is what we found just before the narration properly is going to start. So this is the beginning of the narration, indeed. And here we can see this boy lying on bed with a wheelchair by his side and thinking, I wish I could fly. So we have projection functioning in two different ways. On the one hand, if we pay attention to the verbal mode, we have, I wish I could fly. We know that there is projection there. So there's projection in the verbal mode constructed through a mental clause, which is projecting a material clause, which is the projected one. But on the other hand, what we have is that there is also intermodal projection. So we have the boy projecting, the boy, which is constructed visually, is projecting a thought bubble in the visual mode. And the idea is projected as a clause complex in the verbal mode. So it can be acting in this double way if you want to. The approach I'm going to follow is not just, if you want to, is not just relying on the work done in systemic functional linguistics, but as I am concerned with analyzing characters in narratives, I'm also relying on semantics and text linguistics and narratology. So, and the work done by scholars like Maria Nikolajeva and Carol Scott, or Bettina Kummerling-Maybauer, or other scholars that have been dealing with the analysis of picture books from different perspectives. But mainly, as I said before, on the work done by Claire Painter, Jim Martin, and Len Unsworth, who have extended the system networks of analyzing visual narratives to the analysis of picture books in particular. I'm also, what I'm going to talk about, the examples I'm going to use and the kind of research that I'm drawing from comes from two research projects. The first one was the analysis of children's picture books portraying non-normative gender identities and or alternative family models, which was led by Professor Jesus Moya Guijarro at the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, and which was funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation, and that covered 4 years, in which we were analyzing a corpus of 40 picture books dealing with those topics. And there you can see one of the outcomes of that project, the edited book by Jesus and Aja Ventola, dealing with this multimodal approach to challenging gender stereotypes in children's picture books. And my chapter in that volume, I will be referring to that very often in this second part of the talk. And now we have an ongoing project that I am leading together with Professor Carmen Santamaria Garcia from the University of Alcalá in Spain, and with Jesus and Aja and many other members. And now we are focusing our attention on children's picture books about migration. We are also looking into those ones in particular. So we have changed the theme of the picture books that we are analyzing. We are working with a corpus of 60 picture books on migration. And we also are looking into how this can apply to multicultural and multilingual environments. And it is also funded by the Spanish Ministry. And this has just started a few months ago, and it will last until 2025. So I would like to address the challenges, as I said at the beginning of my talk, that I have found, the kind of decisions that you have to make when you are attempting to put in practice the theoretical framework of how to analyze characters in this kind of multimodal texts. Typically what happens is that we attempt to do a content analysis. So we have to categorize the features that we are going to analyze. And of course, we have to decide what is the unit of analysis that we are going to use. I'm also talking about carrying out a systematic analysis, not an exhaustive analysis, which means that I am not going to refer to other layers of meaning. I'm not going to be concerned, at least in this talk or in the work that I have been carrying out, on interpersonal or interactional meaning or textual or compositional meanings. That, of course, we cannot ignore, but what I have been doing and what I'm doing in terms of focusing on representational resources is just to put them in the background. So it is true that you cannot avoid considering them when you are carrying out the practical analysis. But I'm trying to be very careful in not interfering or in not letting them interfere with the kind of representational resources or experiential resources that are being used. So why so? Because this is what allows me to look into representation in terms of frequency and distribution of the participant roles as well. So this is combining with a quantitative approach, which is a cumulative approach of characterization at the same time. So the idea is that we have to operationalize how the character's representation is going to be identified in the texts. So we can look into the attributes, we can look into the agency of the characters, and we can look also into the character relations as well. So in terms of how we interpret what a character is, I'm relying on this idea from narratology, which that the character is a construct that is put together by the reader, but it is put together by the reader, or the analyst in this case, from various indications dispersed throughout the text, as Riemann-Kennan says, which means that we are relying on the textual on the textual information that we have in order to put together how this character is constructed in a certain way or another. So if we are dealing with a transitivity analysis, that means that we are going to look whether the character along the story, and remember that we are talking of very short stories. This is not a representative example of the type of picture books that we are dealing with, but because in general terms, we can think of between 20, 30 openings, okay? We can have maybe loads of verbal information or maybe not. So it's not about the quantity of verbal information or not, but it is about the quantity of information that we have in total that corresponds to the character representation. And this is why if we want to depict the character or analyze the character and be able to conclude that the character is depicted in a certain way or another, we need this kind of systematic analysis. We cannot do an exhaustive analysis, or we don't need to do it. So first of all, what unit of analysis? I'm going to refer to 3 different units of analysis that are typically used when dealing with this kind of material. So first of all, we have what is called the double spread. And you have a very nice example taken from Dreamers, which is a wonderful, very recommendable picture book by Yuyi Morales, Mexican, but established in the United States. And she's telling the story of this woman and her baby going as migrants to the United States. So the thing is that here we are looking into the double spread as a unit, or we should do that sometimes at least, because what we have is a continuity between the verso, that is to say the left page, and the recto, the page on the right, there's continuity in the visual construal of the meaning. So we cannot just think of in terms of pages or not. We have the limits of the pages, but apart from that, we have this continuity, and there is also this directionality, which is both cultural and structural, which means that the elements, if we attend to compositional textual meaning, are arranged in a direction, in a certain direction that is also meaningful. So we can identify horizontal relations as well, like even, new, and so on. We rely on Kress and Van Leeuwen for that as well. So directionality goes from left to right, and in Western cultures at least, and so on and so forth, which is not ideational as such. But that means that in a double spread, we can also look into, we can also take that kind of perspective as well. So the double spread is a material, objective, practical unit. It is material because the limits are set for us. We don't have to make decisions as to the limits of the unit are like. And it is also dealing with, it is based on the expression plane. It is not about semantics. It is the space that we have there and the limits of that space that are set for us. So in that sense, it is good because it is material and objective. So we don't have this subjectivity of the analyst at all. We can use this, or it's appropriate to use it, or efficient, or good to use this, because we can have very often, or we want to have a logogenetic perspective. So we are going to look into the story from the narrative point of view as it is developing along. So we can consider the double spreads along the story as well. That is one possibility. Another possibility is that rather than having this kind of material objective units, we could rely on the analysis of events or episodes or phases, stages, and so on and so forth. And I have brought a nice example of an exhaustive analysis dealing with a specific episode from Iris Pereira and her colleagues, and Jill and Sila. A very recent work that they have published. So what happens here when we're using this kind of unit is that the boundaries of these units are very fuzzy. So somehow they are analyzed in positions, which means that it is the analyst who has to decide, of course, relying on the textual syndrome, the constellation of different features that we find there, that are how many episodes, how many phases, how many stages, how many events we are identifying in the text, and therefore how many of them we are going to analyze as units at all. It is not that subjective, if you want to, because of course we are relying on the objectivity of the text, which is to say that we can discern, we can identify congruent and systematic and consistent elements that tell us when there is a transition from one episode or from one stage, from one phase to another, for instance. But it is, all in all, it is a pragmatic subjective unit. It is pragmatic as a paragraph is a pragmatic unit. It is imposed. A paragraph is imposed by the writer. An episode is, or a stage or phase in this sense, is imposed by the analyst. And we are dealing with a semantic plane. We are not dealing with the content plane. We are dealing with a semantic discourse here. Or discourse semantics, sorry. Here we can study as well, or we can rely on horizontal relations as well, because we are dealing with sequential and narrative features. So typically related to the plot or the subplots and so on. So it's still, this is also a logogenetic perspective. And finally, we can also rely on the figure as a unit of analysis, which is the one that not only me, but also other scholars such as Pereira, Jill, and Sila have done, relying on figures as the unit for transitivity analysis. You have a very I don't know how to describe the example that you have there taken from the island, very harsh example, and it's a true story. I don't know whether to recommend it or not. Of course I do, but the thing is that here we can see that we can analyze this. Of course, this is a double spread. This is part of an episode or an event, whatever. But the thing is that we can also look into this as a figure, sorry, which means that we can recognize a process, we can recognize participants, and in this particular case, there is no circumstantial information like a background, a street, or some kind of landscape or whatever. So when we're dealing with figures, we are dealing with a transitivity unit. So we recognize the element, there, and we look into how they are connected in one way or another, how each of them is contributing to meaning in a certain way to this ideational or experiential representational meaning. So it is a meaning unit. So it is a theoretical unit. So it is relying on both the expression and the content planes. This unit has a lower fuzziness than the pragmatic ones. Lower doesn't mean that it is not going to have fuzzy boundaries, as we will see later with some example. And we are going to have this sequential cumulative perspective that I explained before, when we're attempting to analyze characters as being represented through the kind of participant roles that they have along the story. And the good thing about it is that we can work with common analytical categories for visual and verbal realization. So we can recognize an actor when we look at it and when we read it. So when the actor is constructed visually and verbally. So this, as I said before, also will allow us to carry out systematic analysis, also exhaustive ones, but systematic ones as well. We have just one example there of how a character, Oliver, from Oliver Button is Sissy, the Tommy De Paola picture book from the 70s, how Oliver is construed visually and also verbally. So challenges of complex figures. So the thing is that figures are efficient, I would say, units, particularly for this purpose. But one of the examples that we looked at before is this taken from My Name Is No Refugee. So one of the questions that we can wonder about is how many units, how many figures do we have here? This is the verso page. I didn't reproduce the recto page. It's more of this, but this is enough for a way of example. So are we going to say that there is a single figure here, that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 figures because we have 7 images? So the thing is that the boundaries are not that easy, because we could follow the verbal construal, but we can also follow the visual construal. So we have to make that kind of decisions, that we are not saying that we are going to find ideally, well, that would be very boring really, but we are not going to typically find one image, one clause, or one sentence. This is not how it works. So the thing is that this is why the figures, deciding how many figures we are going to have forces you to consider the limits again, so the boundaries, and be clear about why you are going to consider that this is one single figure or not. Sometimes we are going to find, very often we are going to find simultaneous actions and relations. For instance, we have looked into the boy projecting his idea, I wish I could fly. In the opening stage of this story, which is the one that you have on the right on top, how many participants can we distinguish here? Because we have the boy sitting on the wheelchair, we have a person holding the wheelchair, we have a flock of birds, and we have the verbal information saying in a place where mud and sand become sea. So this is the beginning of something, the beginning of the story. So if we are analyzing this as a figure, to start with, we can distinguish three kinds of participants. We can distinguish the boy, we can distinguish the flock of birds, and we can distinguish another human character holding the wheelchair. If we move into the following opening, what we find is what you can see below on the right. So it's like a different perspective on the same representation. This time we don't have the background, so this is suddenly this is like a conceptual image rather than a narrative one. But we have like the verbal narration is advancing and saying a godwit with white wing patches flies up with his flock. The moment is right for the long journey north. So this time, if we were tempted to focus our attention on the boy as the main character in the story, or as the main character, the main participant in the top opening, now we are changing our mind into the godwit with the wide wing patches as being the character the story is going to be about. And something which is also interesting is that we are not very sure about which of those birds is the one that the verbal information is referring to, because this is represented as one specimen in this group of different birds. So it's the flock, constructed as such. So we have simultaneity of actions and at the same time simultaneity of relations, and we have to make our decision as well. Of course, it is very often the case that our decisions are going to be as readers. We are reading the story, so we know that all those resources are meant to focus on something, on some character, on another character, and so on and so forth. So the decisions are not going to be made strictly relying on theoretical ground, but very often on practical ground as readers, as the story is, the narration is being developed. So we also have challenging categories, or there is a challenge in the categories that we are considering. Not all scholars consider exactly the same categories when we are dealing with ideational meaning or experiential meaning on the one hand and representational meaning on the other. For instance, if we take this very nice summary of ideational meaning systems across image and language from Claire Painter in the Routledge Companion to Picture Books, what we have is that the meaning potential is realized through different actions, recognize 5 recognized actions. One, the characters are represented as through character attribution, and then we have the circumstantial information in the setting. But the thing is that if we go to the range of processes that we can distinguish in terms of verbal information, verbal resources, you know that we have 3 main ones, but all in all 6 ones, depending on the approach, 3 core ones, and maybe the other are subsidiary to the others, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to discuss that. But the thing is that the range of options is different. As I said before, we are not going to find existential processes constructed visually, at least not in my interpretation of existential processes. But the thing is that behavioral processes are not considered by Painter neither. And we are, as we will see later, I do not fully agree with that. I know that behavioral processes are, let's say, tricky, to say the least, in the systemic functional grammar, because they are open to different considerations as well, and Cardiff grammar considers them in a different way, and some scholars don't consider behavioral processes at all. I'm not discussing that neither. I am considering behavioral processes. So if you want to, in the traditional description by Halliday, but Painter doesn't, for instance.
Izis,
yeah,
2 minutes maybe to have some time for questions.
Okay,
discussion.
so I will try to sum up. Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay, so I'm just going further, okay, because I will get back to this idea of what happens with behavioral processes as well. Okay, so the thing is that typically the characterization is thought of as being relying on figures of being, attributive, identifying, and so on and so forth. But what happens is that when dealing with how characters are represented, and particularly when we are dealing with a visual mode, the thing is that, as I said before, we have a simultaneity of resources. Everything is presented there at the same time. The comparison, the contrast, what the character is doing. So we can verbalize the doings of the character in many different ways. Depending on how we verbalize those doings that we are seeing, we will go for some figures or others. Typically, we are also, even if unconsciously or very consciously, we are looking into how they are mirroring or connecting the visual and the verbal and so on. So here we can in the end, what happens is that we are saying, well, this is a figure of doing, because what I see as main meaning construed is that Elmer is holding a cookie and a spoon and smiling. So typically we are going to have a combination of those, but we have to decide all the same. So it is also the thing that we have, the characters are represented, particularly when we are dealing with characters that we can call social characters or interpreted socially, that they are also represented through symbolic attributes as well, which are meaningful depending on what we are talking about. So for instance, if we are dealing with gender themed picture books, it's very often the case that we are going to find stereotypical attributes constructed in certain ways, and they are emphasized or they are consistent along the story in the construal of the character as well. Okay, so I'm skipping this. These are different ways of how the different figures of doing, saying, and sensing are construed visually. Characters are also construed through comparison and contrast. And again, what we have is that both things, both possibilities, the similarities and the things that make them different are available simultaneously as well. But social characters in particular are construed in reference to the other characters, to the other participants in the story as well. Okay, so for instance, in gender challenging identities, this is typically construed, those identities are typically construed through relations of contrast and of conflict. In terms of migration, we are still looking into that. So, but the thing is that we have the work carried out by Van Leeuwen years ago on the description or the analysis of social actors. For instance, Chris Hart have used that for analyzing migration in the press, in media discourse. We still are seeing how this is happening in the picture books in particular, whether they are constructed as flocks of birds, maybe, as in here, or maybe in a different way, like in terms of conflict, as in gender, challenging gender identities books as well. Okay, so finally, and very quickly or as quickly as I can, the thing is that when coming across describing social characters, it is that we need some kind of above the clause above the clause units. Figures is not enough. Because if we are talking about social construal of characters, we are talking about, for instance, the bully or the teaser or some kind of social labels that we use for people and accordingly for how those characters are represented in stories. And the thing is that the representation of those characters is carried out through the construal of different figures of behavior. So those figures of behavior consist of figures of different types. This is stemming or getting back to Halliday, 1973, when he talks about semantic networks, well, system networks, and in relation to behavioral patterns. So it is again like talking about patterns of social behavior. And it is by considering the given social context, the one which determines the meaning of those behaviors. So it's not as easy as saying, well, the character is carrying this action, like throwing a ball to the other participant. But if the intention of the character is hitting the other participant, then we have this kind of social behavior because we interpret some kind of a positive or in this case negative intention in that. So it goes further than that. So the thing is that transitivity can cater for that, but my point is that we cater for that in terms of a figure complex of behaving. So similarly to noun complex or to prepositional phrase complex and so on, what I have proposed in this chapter that I told you about is that we need this figure complex of behaving unit in order to be able to cater for social characters in particular. We have other kinds of challenges like figurative and symbolic meanings used in the visual mode and so on, but that's it. So just to recap, the specific challenges that I have been discussing, the first one is methodological. So the choice of an appropriate or an efficient unit that can help you in the analysis that you want to carry out. And the analytical ones, well, we have the question of the figure boundaries, the simultaneity of actions and relations, the categories that we are using for identifying participation or participant roles, the simultaneous availability of visual information that cater for comparison, similarities, and contrast differences at the same time. So it's how we are imposing our perspective on what we are analyzing in each case. Social roles through figure complexes of behavior, which is a unit above the clause, as I said, and symbolic and figurative meanings construed. References, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Izis. Technically, we have 1 minute to the hour, but I don't know, Izis, if you can stay around, Gail, if we could maybe take a few more minutes to respond to, ask questions about that fascinating, very rich, semiotically filled talk. So would anybody like to ask a question? Feel free to put it in the chat if you want, and I can ask it, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question or make a comment. If not, I do have a question.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I wonder, do you see, or in your work have you found, are there parallels between the challenges that the analyst faces, and you mentioned, you know, the analyst also approaches it as a reader, and the challenges you think a child reader would have?
Yeah, that's a very different perspective, of course. The children's approach to this is very different, which means that okay, I didn't comment on this, but picture books, and this is a lot of literature on this, has to do with whether they are addressing well, many of them are considered crossover And crossover means that they are addressing to different audiences, adult people who are going to be typically the readers for children, and children that maybe they cannot read on themselves. So that makes things more complex indeed, because what happens is that they are addressing both audiences at the same time, which means that very often the story is accessed directly by children on the visual mode. So they access the visual information, but they are not accessing the verbal information, which is very often mediated by the adult reader. And the adult reader also deals with this. This is even more complex because we also have the kind of reading that the adult person is going to make. Like, for instance, mimicking the voices that they think that the character has. So when we read for children, we read in a specific way as well. So that makes things more complex indeed. So typically what happens is that this intertwining of visual and verbal resources open up the box of asking a lot of questions when you are reading the story. Typically, this is not a straightforward reading of from an adult to a child or a group of children, but typically this is interspersed with different comments and questions, and many questions from the adult to the child. Have you seen the fox? The fox is looking at the hen. What do you think that is going to happen? Things like that. So it is this kind of reading that we're talking about, really. So very different perspectives, the analyst one and the child's one, yeah, I would say.
And I see Kieran has a question.
There's a question from Sheena first in the chat.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Should I ask that one first? Yeah. So the question Sheena has is, how did you choose the 60 texts on migration? Yeah. So the corpus decisions.
Yeah. Well, different ways. Many of them. Okay, from other scholars that have been dealing with this kind of theme before, there is quite a few works dealing with focusing on this kind of material, but also from suggestions from teachers and parents in the internet. I mean, there are blogs and so on, and they comment on specific titles for recommendations, but very importantly as well, from lists of prize awards, award winners, and so there are lists from different awards produced every year. So Caldecott Medal or Pura Belpré Prize and so on. So in different countries, there are very prestigious awards for children's literature. And there is typically one category dealing with picture books in particular. So for instance, Dreamers, I came across that one from a list because that won the award of the Pura Belpré Award in 2020, I think. So different sources, but we have tried to be to have picture books from many different areas in the world as well. But we are compiling English, picture books produced in English or English translations. We have considered some wordless ones, like the two that I showed before as well. Because for certain kind of analysis that they can be used as well, even if they are not bimodal, technically speaking. So that's it. I cannot hear you.
Thank you. Yes, I was
Okay.
muted. Sorry. Kieran, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
I cannot hear it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can't hear either.
Kieran, are you there to ask your question?
It's unmuted, but
Maybe you can type it in the chat if your mic isn't working.
Well, I was just thinking, Izis, on what you were just explaining about assembling your corpus, you know, even books in translation, your work in translation too. I mean, I think it would be fascinating to also think about, you know, what kind of verbal representations are chosen in translation.
And not only verbal, which is also pretty interesting. There are some people in the team working with translation. So for some of them, we have two versions of the same book, typically in English and in Spanish. For instance, The Journey by Francesca Sana, which is a book that has been translated into so many different languages. Or Mexique, which is a Spanish one, but we have a version in English as well. And which is interesting is that as this material is dealing with the sensitive topic of migration, and some of the stories refer to as a very specific context of situation, a historical sometimes. What happens is that translations into other languages don't only involve the translation of the verbal information, but sometimes they have new parts in the what is called the epitext or the peritext, so the parts that are not the narration itself, but explaining the situation or explaining the story behind the real story behind the fictional narrative.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, Gail?
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, you've got the corpus, and the corpus is brilliant, and thank you for such a really, really stimulating talk, raising all those questions. But my question is more like, did you have a hypothesis or a research question that you wanted to actually answer when you looked at the 60 books, or was it more of an emergent study where you looked at what came out of the books?
Thank you very much. The thing is that there is lots of literature done on picture books, not that many on thematic picture books, which means picture books revolving around a specific theme. Basically, most of what you can read about picture books on migration comes from teachers who are concerned with using that kind of material with their students. And their approach about them, or their approach on this kind of material is very different from a linguistic approach, which means that there is no systematic analysis of them, basically. So the things that they highlight in terms of the topics covered and so on are not enough to have a comprehensive idea of all what is there. So in that sense, there is no one hypothesis that is beforehand. I mean, we have what we have learned in our previous project, at least in the kind of analysis that I'm carrying out. What I learned in that kind of material, the one dealing with challenging gender identities, and I was looking into the representation of challenging gender identities of boys in those stories, in those picture books. What I learned there, I was curious about whether this could be applied to this new. The thing is that challenging or a non-normative identity, as it is construed in a picture book, has certain features in terms of a social character. And a migrant is also a social character. A migrant is not just a traveler, it is construed socially in a certain way. So I was curious about finding out whether there are some kind of similarities in terms of the construal that migrants have in these picture books. So it's not a hypothesis as such, but it is a connection with what we have gathered in the previous research, really. So it's more tentative, yeah.
Okay, well, Kieran, we're going to try again to see if we can hear the question. Yes, sorry, it doesn't seem to be working. And Karen did mention that the question is a little bit complicated to put in the chat. What I was wondering is if I could pop your email into the chat, and if anybody wants to follow up directly with Izis, they can. Sheena does ask if your 2022 paper or these slides could be made available.
The 22 paper is the chapter in the Jesus and Ajas volume, so it's in Routledge. It is not available, it is not open. I'm sorry for that, but
library collections might have the ebook.
So it's a Routledge series on multimodality, so it's very likely that you have that at your library. I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you so much again, Izis, for a fabulous talk. Thank everybody for coming. And there is a question in the chat from Ken Tan. Perhaps the analyst's decision is based more on the purpose of the analysis than the children's reading practice. So it's a comment. After all, the analyst may try to make explicit all the potential meanings on a page to reach some kind of saturation. Specific meanings will have to be actualized during the reading practice through interaction with the adult.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, nice comment. Well, again, if there are no further comments or questions,
I just would like to say, thank you very much one more time. I hope you enjoyed, you learned a bit about multimodality if you were not concerned with this kind of material, which I found fascinating. I never say thank you enough times to Jesus for inviting me to be part of the previous project, because this was one way of not reconciling myself, but getting back to something that I loved, which was picture books, and that I hadn't read for years and years. And it is really, truly a fascinating material. So, that's my final point. And I wish I can see you all in Vigo or Sousa in Túnez. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
And our next talk is Sheena Gardner on the 12th of May. So everybody's welcome to come to that too. Thank you so much, Anna.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.